Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. It is my pleasure and distinct honor to introduce my colleague at Flame, whose campus you see on the background here. That's where we are right now, both of us. Professor Michael Hatchet, my colleague. We did a symposium on academic study of religion just I think 2 weeks back, this month only at Flame, and it's my mistake, serious mistake, that I should have invited my colleague who is an expert on philosophy, theology, religious studies, coming from philosophical background, of course. So I guess continuing our theme of symposium on academic study of religion, Professor Hatcher accepted my invitation and he's going to speak on those allied or topics on the periphery. His topic itself is prayer in the periphery. So let me introduce my colleague. Professor Hatcher earned his PhD in philosophy from the University of Southern California, a top destination for Indian students. USC has a lot of thousands of Indian students and remains in the top 3 apparently. He has taught after his PhD from USC in Los Angeles. He has taught at Valparaiso University in Indiana. The name of that university literally means Valley of Paradise, apparently in Spanish. I did some research before I started introducing. And so now he teaches at Flame University for last 5 years. So we are also nested in a scenic valley, as you can see in the background. So his academic journey, therefore, has moved between valleys, both geographical and intellectual, exploring the depths of philosophy and theology, right? Today, he'll be speaking on a fascinating theme, prayer in the periphery, drawing from philosophical theology and phenomenology. Professor Hatcher will explore the possibility of unceasing prayer as envisioned in 1 Thessalonians 5:17 from the New Testament. Interestingly, the name Thessalonica, from which Thessalonians comes, means victory of Thessaly in Greek. With Nike meaning victory, this resonates with Sanskrit words Jai and Vijay, which also mean victory. I did my research. Such linguistic resonances remind us of the deep Indo-European heritage shared by Greek and Sanskrit, bridging traditions and contexts, much like Professor Hatchet does in his work. Through the lens of contextual and marginal awareness, as articulated by Gurevich and Arvidsson, he will invite us to reflect on how individuals might attune themselves to the divine voice while navigating the rhythms of everyday life. Valleys are often places of learning and reflection, where depth of thought can flourish. From Valparaiso, the Valley of Paradise, to the valley setting of Flame University, Professor Hatcher's path has been marked by such spaces of contemplation. Today, he invites us into another kind of valley, the philosophical and theological exploration of unceasing prayer in everyday life. Please join me in warmly welcoming my dear colleague, Professor Michael Hatchet, on your section.
Thank you so much for that introduction. That was awesome. I was taking notes on the things that I was learning from the intro. Yeah, so I do want to explore this concept of praying without ceasing and how it might be possible by means of thinking through a certain kind of puzzle or problem that I've been thinking about. And it does have a parallel in traditions. Oh, I would need to share my screen. It says sharing is not turned on.
Let me figure that out. I think I should be able to do that. Sorry.
Yeah, so I have a Word document that I'd like to share. But yeah, so 1 Thessalonians 5:17 says, pray without ceasing or pray without stopping. And I think there are verses in other traditions. So some of you have shared, there's some verses in I think the Bhagavad Gita, and I have that at the bottom of my handout that are very much parallel. And so I say that because I think the thing we're thinking about, we can think about it together. It's not, I don't think it's just something that has to do with Christianity. Okay, so the puzzle that I'm thinking through is something that I'm calling the problem for praying without ceasing. And so here I'll walk through this problem and then I'll tell you the strategy I'm going to take to try to solve it. Okay, so you can think of it as a set of claims. First one is that 1 Thessalonians 5:17 is an imperative or a command telling us to pray without ceasing. Okay, so we're being told to do this thing. Okay, and the second claim is unless an imperative is incorrect, we ought to do what it tells us to do. So sometimes we're told to do something that we shouldn't do. But if it's true that we ought to do something, then or if the imperative is correct, the thought is, well, I really ought to be doing it. Okay. So if I tell you something that's like horrible, go do something wrong, lie or cheat or steal, that's an imperative in form, but it's an incorrect one. And it's just not true that you ought to do what it tells you to do. Okay, so for ones that are correct, the thought is we ought to do what they tell us to do. Okay, then the next idea is this principle. It's sort of a further specification of a principle in philosophy called ought implies can. Okay, so I'm calling this 3. If we ought to do something, then we are able to do it. And then this is some language that I'm going to clarify as we go on. Then we're able to do it without there being adequate reasons for us to do otherwise. So it's not just that we're able, we're also able to do it, and there's not going to be what I'm calling adequate reasons to do otherwise. And I'll illustrate that in just a moment. Now, the substantive claim that I'm actually going to challenge in this talk is claim 4. We are not able to pray without ceasing, without there being adequate reasons to do otherwise. And if all of these claims are true, it means that this verse here is incorrect. It's just it's telling us something to do, and it's an imperative statement that has the feature of being incorrect or faulty or mistaken. Okay, I want to further illustrate this principle here. Something we're able to do it, and its interplay with 4 as well, whether we're able to pray without ceasing. In one sense, I think that we can pray without ceasing. So I'll give you an example. So consider a person I'm going to call prayerful nun. So she lives in a convent. She is not married. She doesn't have children. She doesn't have significant responsibilities. She does have some work in the convent. So she might have to sweep and garden and do other sorts of things that keep the convent going. But otherwise, her life is structured in such a way, and she herself structures it in such a way that she is, praying all the time. So she has many psalms memorized, and so when she's sweeping or when she's gardening, she's able to recite these mentally or subvocalize them or even sing them. And she just does this constantly. Every single minute, she's doing this. And then she falls asleep. She's praying. She's doing her examen or whatever it is. And then the next morning, she wakes up and she's thinking about God and praying again, right? So the thought is, look, humans can actually do this. We can spend 100% of our time praying. So it's just not true that we're not able to pray without ceasing. Why? Well, because you could be like the prayerful nun, right? I think the worry is still there, and here's the reason why, and that is that for many of us, we have kinds of work and we're ingrained in certain life situations where we have really significant reasons to do differently than the prayerful nun. In other words, to not follow her example, right? So just speaking for myself, if I'm preparing a class, that requires significant mental effort to think about the particular details of that class. And so I can't, it seems to me, be simultaneously reciting Psalm 23. I do have Psalm 23 memorized, but it takes, mental effort and sort of space for me to be reciting that. And then I can't do that simultaneously with doing the work for preparing the class, because I got to think about these details of the arguments or what I'm going to teach my logic students or whatever, right? So the thought is, if I were to try to imitate the prayerful nun, I'd quickly come across these problems. I would fail to be able to do the work that I need to do. I might end up losing my job, and my kids and my wife depend on me. All of this sort of stuff. It seems like I just can't do I just can't do that. Okay, so here's the thought is that I can do it in a sense, but I have these really, really good reasons to not do it, reasons that I'm calling adequate. Okay, so here I'm going to illustrate what an adequate reason to do otherwise than something is. I'll read the definition and then I'll give the illustration, okay? a reason R for one to do otherwise than A, or A could be anything, pray without ceasing, or just anything whatsoever, is adequate if and only if R has enough weight that it is false that one ought to do that original action A. Let me illustrate the principle with a silly example. So here's a silly example. Suppose you're at a ice cream store and you have a good friend who's been to that store before, but you've never been there. And they say, this store is really good, but just because there's one flavor that they do crazy well, it's amazing. It tastes the best. All the other flavors, I've had them and they're really not that good. But their peanut butter toffee is just, it's amazing. It's spectacular. You got to have peanut butter toffee. And so you think, well, look, I ought to choose the peanut butter toffee. That's going to be their best flavor. Well, suppose that you could have it, but suppose it's also true in this story that you have a peanut butter allergy. So if you were to eat something that has peanut butter in it, your skin would swell up and you'd have to like pull out your EpiPen and stab yourself, and then you'll barely live. It opens up, like it's constricting your lungs or whatever, right? Okay, so is it still true that you could try the peanut butter toffee? Yeah, it looks like you'll survive. You brought your EpiPen or whatever. But the thought is that the fact that you have a peanut butter allergy, so that's that fact. That's a reason to do otherwise than choose the peanut butter toffee. That's adequate. It's just not the case that you ought to choose the peanut butter toffee, because that reason is so significant that you should do otherwise. You should pick some other flavor, right? So that's a silly example, but the point is that it seems like we in our lives are not able to pray without ceasing without there being these significant reasons to do otherwise. And if there are those reasons, then it's just not true in the end that I ought to do it. And that's the worry. Okay, so why does it seem that we have this limitation that we're not able to pray without ceasing, without there being these significant and indeed adequate reasons to do otherwise? So I think there's two significant reasons why 4 is plausible, that we're not able to do this without those reasons. First, we appear to have significant limitations when it comes to our ability to pray while also doing other things. I kind of illustrated that with talking about, I can't recite Psalm 23 and also prepare the details of my logic class. It seems just beyond my capacity. Now, maybe I could imagine a supermind that just like seems just buzzing with like 4 lobes and that can do all these things, and then it would be easy. But I'm not like that. Like I can't think well of much more than about one thing at a time, in a certain sense of one thing, right? So I'm just limited. And I think many of us, maybe we can say we relate to that. We're limited as humans and how much we can sort of do mentally at a time. Okay, second thing, many of those things appear to be things we ought to be doing. So I ought to be preparing for the logic class I'm going to teach, or whatever it is. So you can think of your own thing that you need to do. Okay. All right, so let's move on. So I'm actually going to end up rejecting this premise, and we'll see how, but at least we need to know why it's worth worrying about, why you might take it to be true. Okay, so I'm going to use some tools that I've sort of developed in other papers. This is like this presentation is like the outline of the third paper in a series of papers I've been writing. So there's a paper where I argued for what prayer is in the New Testament. And since the verse is from the New Testament, I think that's appropriate to use that account of prayer. And so anyways, this is the account of how I'm going to think about prayer. One is praying to God at time t, if and only if one is engaged in a communicative activity directed toward God at t. So communicative activity, I mean by that an activity where you're either speaking or listening. Now, when I say speaking, I don't mean it doesn't have to be verbal. You can speak in all sorts of ways. So for example, someone who can't speak, maybe they are mute or deaf or whatever, they could speak through certain ways of directing their thoughts towards God, or even using sign language or whatever, right? So the thought is just that you're directing a message towards some recipient. That's speaking. And there's lots of modalities or ways that you could do that. Okay. Similarly, listening, it doesn't have to be just auditory listening. Rather, it's a certain way of orienting yourself to another person so that you're sort of making space to receive a message from that person. And of course, one way to do that is auditory sort of attention, but it's all modalities, right? That could be possible and relevant there. All right. Okay, so I'm going to assume that account of prayer. And next, what I want to do is I want to be inspired by perhaps the most in-depth exploration of praying without ceasing in the Western tradition, which is a book called The Way of a Pilgrim. And there's a passage that sort of illustrates one possible solution. And so I want to develop that possible solution. I think it's a beautiful passage. So what I want to do is read it aloud, and it's an example where someone is trying to say, look, no, we can pray without ceasing, even if you have to prepare your logic class, even if you have to focus really intently on something. Okay, that's the context for this paragraph. So here I'll read it aloud, okay? Imagine that a king commanded you to write an essay on some difficult subject in his very presence at the feet of his throne. Now, no matter how completely engrossed you would be in your assignment, the presence of the king would not allow you to forget even for a moment that you are not working alone. This very real awareness of the presence of the king clearly illustrates the possibility of praying even while one is engaged in mental work. So for this to work, you really got to just imagine it yourself. Imagine you're in some castle and the king invites you to sit right next to his throne, okay? And then he says, oh, I heard you're really good at writing about this topic or whatever. Sit right over there, right next to me and write about it. The thought is that in the periphery of your conscious awareness, you're going to be aware that the king is right there. Even as you start to transition and really start to think about your topic, still in the background, there's this sort of awareness or consciousness of the king that's next to you. Okay, how could you possibly forget? Like you could even no matter how engrossed, you're still sort of aware of the king right there. But there's a couple things I want to say about the strategy that I think this suggests. So one thing is that I think this paragraph is assuming that prayer has a what it's likeness or phenomenology. In other words, there's something it's like for the person praying for them to be praying at that time. So it's a qualitative feature of their experience. That's what philosophers mean by has a phenomenology, okay? So that's this claim here. Praying to God makes a difference to one's phenomenal consciousness at T. I say that because the example is trying to get us to notice a phenomenal feature of our consciousness, namely this awareness of the king. And the thought is, it's just as that can hum along in the background, so could prayer. And I'm thinking, well, what he wants us to think is that prayer is also something that has a phenomenal property, or there's something it's like, and it can also hum along in the background somehow, in the background of phenomenal consciousness. Okay, so I don't think the analogy really works unless we assume that prayer also is supposed to have a phenomenology that can then be in the sort of the background or periphery of our consciousness. Okay, it's assuming that our total conscious experience has a certain structure of center to more peripheral things, and that those peripheral things, there's something that's like that for them to occur and hum along in the background, as it were. Okay, now the overall strategy I want to use, since prayer for me is speaking or listening, to me, I think, well, speaking I think is a little trickier or more difficult to maintain than maybe listening. So it's just a strategic or methodological choice. Let's see if we can have peripheral listening regardless of what we're doing. Is that possible for us as humans? Okay, and so the claim I want to explore is this claim that I'm going to call peripheral listening. We are able to listen for God without ceasing. So there's a substantive claim in the periphery of our phenomenal consciousness. And we can do that without there being adequate reasons to do otherwise. So basically, I'm exploring whether this claim could be true. Could it be true that we could do this? Okay. Couple of things I want to do to clarify the exploration of this claim, peripheral listening. Could it be true? First is I want to say one thing about listening. So I have a claim here that I call listening. What do we mean by listening? And here's what I'm going to mean. One is listening for another person if and only if this is true. One is making it the case that the other is an object of one's consciousness, and you're doing that in a manner which makes one better positioned to hear or understand them should they speak. So you're listening, you're doing something, so you're making something the case. Okay, it's not a wholly passive sort of thing. the thing you're doing is you're making them an object of consciousness, but you're also doing it in a certain way. You're doing it in a way that makes it more likely for you to hear them should they speak. There's actually ways to make somebody an object of consciousness that doesn't increase the likelihood that you'll understand them should they speak. So suppose you're at a talk and you find the person's topic super boring for whatever reason. I hope this is not something like that. But okay, so the talk, you're really bored by the speaker, but you're supposed to look like you're paying attention because other people are looking at you and you want to be showing respect to the speaker. And so you decide to play a little game where maybe you count like, I don't know, the freckles on their head, or you try to, something where it involves focusing on the person in some way, but you're not really listening to what they're saying. Okay. So you're making the person an object of your consciousness, but not in a manner that increases your chance of hearing what they're saying. In fact, you're kind of like distracting yourself. So you're not even going to be able to understand what they're saying. So it's not just you're making the person an object of consciousness, you're doing it in a certain way where it increases the chance that you're going to understand what they're saying, that you're going to hear what they're saying, and so on and so forth. Okay, that's listening. Okay. And here's the big distinction that I want to explore in this talk. So the strategy is, can we listen in the periphery? And if you read philosophers and psychologists who talk about the periphery, there's a really important distinction between two parts of the periphery. What I'm going to call the context, and then what I'm going to call the margin. Okay. And the question is, okay, are we listening in the context or are we listening in the margin? And there's actually reasons to worry about either of those, although I'll suggest that there's a way through the worry, okay? But first I want to illustrate this distinction because I think it's pretty important. So here's an example. Suppose you're out on a morning walk, okay? And I like this walk here. It sounds like a great morning walk. So I'll read the example. On my morning walk in the woods, I am struck by and I focus on a pink cherry tree in full bloom. And actually, I think it's going to help our understanding of the example for me to color code this. So let me make that red, or maybe that's pink, whatever. Okay, so that, so I'm struck by and I focus on that. Okay, so I'm focusing on that thing. Okay, the pink cherry tree, is dwarfed by the trees surrounding it, but their more ordinary green shades only accentuate its striking color. Okay, so I'm going to highlight the trees surrounding the pink tree. Let's make those, say, purple. Okay. Okay, and then finally, the final part of the example. Also, I am wearing wool socks under my hiking boots. And though I have been awake for hours, I have not yet eaten breakfast. So I've got this sensation of the wool socks, and then I have this faint sensation of hunger, right? I haven't eaten breakfast yet, so I've got a little bit of that hungry feeling, okay? I'm going to label those blue. I'm going to make them blue, okay? Now, all of these things, the pink cherry tree, the more ordinary green trees, and then the wool socks, and then the sensation of hunger, all of these are, in some sense, objects of your consciousness at this time. They're all there. Like a full and complete description of what it's like to be you should include all of these things and more, right? However, there's an important difference between these objects of consciousness, okay? And so some of them, namely the trees surrounding the pink tree, are experienced as relevant to the central focus, and some of them are not. Okay, the central focus is the pink cherry tree. Okay, that's what I'm going to call the center. Okay, and this experience of relevance, let me define it here. For objects O1 and O2, O1 is experienced as relevant to O2 if and only if. So this is the thing that the trees surrounding the pink cherry tree have. O1 is experienced as pointing or having to do with O2 by virtue of what O1 and O2 are. So the green trees, they are also trees. They're also nearby. They have a color. So they have this sort of like reference, or they have something to do with the pink tree. The pink tree is like one of their fellow tree citizens or whatever, right? So it's due to what these things are, they have this sort of relationship, okay? And that's why they're sort of experienced together, okay? Because of that, O1, and so you can think there of the ordinary green trees, impacts how O2, the pink cherry tree, appears in experience. Okay, so the pink cherry tree, its pinkness is accentuated, right? So the ordinary green sort of accentuates the pinkness, the awesomeness of that cherry tree. Like it's kind of a rare experience to see like pink cherry tree in full bloom. It's like really beautiful if you see it. And so all the other trees around it, it sort of pops out like in contrast. Okay. So those more ordinary trees, they affect how the central object appears. Okay. And because of this, a transition from O2 as center, so for example, the pink tree, to the O1, the other trees, as center, is thereby smooth or continuous in experience. So you can be focusing on the pink tree, but then for you to think, oh, there's all these other trees around too, that's not like a radical jump in how you're managing your attention. It's experienced as smooth and continuous. It's just sort of this kind of flow, right? And to contrast, these features do not hold of the wool socks, right? Okay, so the sensation of wool on your feet, this is not experienced as relevant or having anything to do with the pink tree. And if you were to, while looking at the tree, then suddenly focus on your wool socks, that would be kind of this break in your experience, right? We'd say you have been distracted or something like that. The wool socks don't really relate to the pink tree. They don't affect how it appears. And so it doesn't like smoothly sort of pull you into paying attention to the wool socks, okay? So that's how to think about the difference between what I've got as purple here and what I've got as blue. The blue stuff is not relevant. It's not experienced as relevant, whereas the purple stuff is, okay? And the basic thing is that the red is the center, purple is the context, and blue is the margin, okay? So the context and the margin, those are two different ways of thinking of the periphery, okay? Because the central thing is the pink tree, and everything else is peripheral in some sense. But there's very much a difference between that context that's experienced as relevant, and then further out, as you might think of it, the margin, which is not experienced as relevant. There's very much a difference between the surrounding trees and then the sensation of wool on your foot, okay? This distinction between what I'm calling the center, the context, and the margin, so these threefold way of thinking about conscious experience, it's not really due to me, it's due to Aaron Gurwitch, and I think I first heard of it by a philosopher named Sven Arvidsson, who wrote a book called The Sphere of Attention. So this is not like original to me, but I'm just applying it to this problem. And I'm using, I think, Sven Arvidsson's language. No, I'm saying I'm following Gurwitch with the language. This is Gurwitch's language. This is Arvidsson's language. I had a little mistake in my handout. Yeah. Anyways, doesn't really matter. Okay, so what matters is the distinction. Okay. Okay. So I'll return to this if there's questions about this distinction, but it'll do a lot of work for us. That's why I sort of belabored this example, right? So I hope we can see the difference between the contextual features of our experience and then the sort of marginal, okay? Where an example of marginal would be the sensation of wool on your foot in the example I've given, and an example of contextual would be, or something in the context would be the surrounding trees that surround that pink tree that you're focused on, okay? All right, here's the dilemma. Because the thing to think is like, okay, if I'm supposed to listen for God in the periphery, does that mean I'm listening for him in the context of my experience or in the margin? Because it's going to be one or the other, because it splits the periphery in two based on just whether the object is experienced as relevant or not. So it has to be one or the other. And there's reasons to worry about both possibilities. And so that's sort of the dilemma. And I'll read out what we have as the dilemma here. One is listening for God in the periphery of consciousness only if one is making it the case that God is an object in the periphery of consciousness in a manner which makes one better positioned to hear or understand him should he speak. That's just an application of listening, okay, to the notion of the periphery of consciousness, okay? Here's the worry. God is an object in the periphery of consciousness only if either God is in the context or God is in the margin. So those are our two options. Okay, premise 8. We are not able to make it the case that God is in the context without ceasing, without there being adequate reasons to do otherwise. So the thought is, to put God in the context is actually really cognitively demanding. Okay. So in other words, the thought of God, and God would have to be affecting the appearance of what you're centrally focused on. Okay. Um, so that every single, so just as when you're looking at the pink tree, the tree surrounding are sort of right there and affecting how it appears. If I'm thinking about modus ponens, which I'm going to teach my students, somehow the thought of God must be somehow affecting how that appears. But it turns out that when we're doing really deep engaged work, we need sort of a lot of our working memory to be there and operative and affecting the appearance. So as it turns out, like when I'm thinking about modus ponens, what affects how that appears is not modus ponens, but modus tollens, this other like very similar sort of logical rule that also deals with conditionals and all of these other sort of related thoughts about pedagogy and so on. Like, so as I'm thinking through these different things, that's the context that informs the flow of my thought. And I need that to be the case for me to really organize a good logic class, for the upcoming week or whatever it is, right? So you really need in your context a lot of different like task relevant sort of thoughts to make your current focus situated properly and for you to understand it and so on. That's like a deep need that people have to do well. And so I gave the example of preparing for a logic course, but imagine a surgeon whose focus is that precise cut that they're making, but suppose it's a complicated surgery that has all of these different elements. And so what should be in his context? It should be the paper that he read a week ago on that particular kind of surgery where it's like, oh, there are these options where, this has this risks and this has this. And so it should inform the decisions that he's making. That should be in the context. If instead he sort of shoves out that and instead he's trying to like pray or listen, and then all he has is this focus on the center, he's actually less sort of informed and able to do the job that he needs to be doing, and he needs to do it well, right? Okay, so it seems like that's an adequate reason to not pray in the context of your experience. It's just too demanding. We can't manage it while also doing what we need to be doing. We need the context and its resources to be geared towards what's task relevant. And some of these tasks are just too important. Okay, so that's the worry for the context. Okay, there's also a worry for the margin. So this is what I'm calling premise 9. We are not able to make it the case that God is in the margin in a manner which makes us better positioned to hear or understand him should we speak. I'm going to actually end up rejecting this premise, okay? But before I reject it, we should understand why why one might endorse it, okay? So there's two reasons that I think there's some initial plausibility to premise 9. Okay, the first is it's really unclear that what's happening in the margin is something that we can sort of actively organize, right? So a good example of something in the margin might be the humming of the air conditioner or things like that. Well, it seems like whether there's an air conditioner humming or whether you have that experience is really not up to you. It's just a part of your external environment. It sort of is just there passively, right? So it's not really clear that I can actually organize the margin of my experience in any meaningful way across time. Okay, so that's sort of an initial worry. Suppose we can get over that worry and there is a way to organize the margin of your experience. Even deeper, even if we can somehow do this, it does not seem that God being in the margin could make one better positioned to hear or understand him should he speak. So for example, marginal items do not impact how the center appears to a person. So that means that way of getting uptake or noticing God's voice is not there. It's not available. So in the case, say, of the pink cherry tree, if another, so the other tree sort of impacts how that tree is experienced. And so you're sort of in this tree experiencing frame of mind. And so the features of those other trees could easily get your attention because they're impacting what you're centrally focused on, right? Okay. Or to go to the example of, I'm thinking about modus ponens, and then relevant to this is a similar role, modus tollens, right? Because there's this relationship between these two things, it's very easy for me to go from one item to the next. Okay. So I could see how listening for God in the context would allow me to be better positioned to hear his voice if he speaks. But none of that has happened. For none of those reasons is being in the margin something that would increase my chance of hearing God's voice. Um, you might think that the margin is just sort of just like your external environment mostly, and like whether it's there or not, like it's just gonna like break you out of what you're doing or it's not. But it's not like you can do anything about it, right? That's sort of the worry. Um, Okay, so I'm going to actually argue that you can do certain things to organize the margin of your experience. So I'm going to argue for what I'm calling not nine, or the opposite of nine. We are able to make it the case that God is in the margin in a manner which makes us better positioned to hear and understand him should he speak. And what I want to do is just give some examples and and then just sort of talk through those examples and say, well, look, there's lots of different ways maybe to do this, but each of these is something that manages the margin and it maybe increases our chance of hearing God's voice if God speaks to us at a time. Okay. So I'll start with one example, and maybe you guys even can think of your own examples. I think I have like 5 different examples. I may not go through all of those because I really want to have, I want to hear what people think about this. So I'll maybe 1 or 2 examples, and then I'll sort of I want to hear question and answer stuff because I'm excited to hear what other people think. But okay, so I'll give the first example. I call it intensive morning prayer. Okay, so Alice, she intensively and centrally prays to God for say an hour in the morning. Because she does this, God is in the margin of her experience for significant periods of her day. Impressions from God are more likely to consolidate as God's voice. She's sort of more sensitive to if God's trying to speak to her, it's like easier to get her attention, it seems because of this. And such experiences are more likely to be salient or sort of and salient means that in your conscious experience that has that feature of popping out. So in your margin, some things can pop out as salient and some things might not. Um, so so suppose there's some background sounds. Okay, so there's a background sound from the AC. Okay, and then there's this other background sound that's of the same volume, but it's like different. It's like you weren't expecting it. Maybe it's actually a faraway alarm, like somebody's testing a sort of a campus alert system, and it's the same volume, but because it's different, you like notice it. Okay, you're like, oh, like after a period of time, you notice that different sound. So there's a period of time where both are in the margin, but one of them has a little more salience to you. Okay. Um, so this example here, so I think there's some parallels to it. If you say listen to one song repeatedly in the morning, where you get the tune, that tune can sort of get stuck into your head, right? And now maybe there's lyrics to the song as well. Maybe now words that are part of those lyrics, if they ever are spoken, they would pop out as like sort of more salient to you because it's like related to this thing that's humming along in the background. So the thought is like if we invest time in praying and sort of making God the focus of our attention for a period of time, then that he can sort of hum along in the background, and then things that would be his speaking to us will become more salient to us. Okay, that's I don't see why that couldn't happen. Um, I mean, it seems like it would take work and it's not an easy thing, but it seems possible. And what it counts as is a way of organizing the margin that does increase our chance of hearing God's voice. Okay, so I'll do one more example, and then I'll sort of basically end with just one final thing. Okay, so something Gurwitch spoke a lot about with the margin is that he thinks that we have a sort of continual marginal awareness of our own body. So even if I'm thinking of something intensely, I still have a marginal awareness of my bodily position, like that I'm seated in a certain way, that my arms are in a certain position, that sort of stuff. And I was thinking that maybe you can leverage that, where you can make the awareness through your body sort of have some kind of reference to God, right? And so suppose there's a person, Betsy, who has this small wooden cross, and where that wooden cross sort of for her is like has this essential reference to God. And of course, in other religions, you could have different kinds of objects that do this sort of thing, okay? But the example is the same. You can change the object. So the cross is very meaningful to her. Any experience of it, whether visual or tactual, so she's supposing holding your hand, that's a tactual experience, has a kind of built-in reference to God and her relationship to God. Because she's always holding this cross, God is in the margin of her experience for significant periods of time. Impressions are more likely to consolidate as God's voice, and such experiences are more likely to be salient to her. So maybe this is another way of organizing the margin, right? So it's sort of using my body and the things that it refers to sort of to allow me to have that connection that's humming along even while I'm focusing. And I think this actually parallels the original example from the way of the pilgrim. So your body is positioned near the king. So in your visual experience, there's like actual, you can see the throne next to you, right? So you're sort of leveraging that automatic awareness you have through your body in a way to sort of try to connect you to God. And that's a marginal, it's in the margin of your consciousness, but maybe it also counts as listening. I have other examples that I could talk about, but I think I'll leave it there. And the thought is look, this is a way to do it. This is listening in the periphery. In fact, it's listening in the margin of your experience, and it could work, right? It may take work, but maybe it can work. Okay, the final thing before opening up for questions and such is this issue of constantly praying. Is there parallels in other religions? And I've talked to a few colleagues, and this is the most underdeveloped portion of the paper I have. I'm just still getting little hints and stuff. I have so much to learn here. But one of my colleagues mentioned some verses from the Bhagavad Gita. And so I think there's some parallels here. So this is the Bhagavad Gita 8:14. And this is the Winthrop Sargent. I know there's lots of translations. Another of my colleagues suggested a translation they like. And so I'm using that one. So here it is. He who thinks of me constantly, I think this is Krishna talking to Arjuna, whose mind does not ever go elsewhere. For him, the yogin who is constantly devoted, I'm easy to reach. So that's early or somewhere in the middle of the Bhagavad Gita. There's this notion of thinking of Krishna constantly, like all the time, right? And near the end, I think you get even a clearer sort of parallel to 1 Thessalonians 5:17. Mentally renouncing all actions in me, devoted to me as the supreme, taking refuge in the yoga of discrimination. There's parts here I don't really understand. Like yoga of discrimination, I don't know what that means. But the end of it, constantly think of me. That looks like a command to someone to be constantly thinking of Krishna. And you could raise the same problem. How could I constantly do that, without having reasons to do otherwise? And, do I do it in the context or the margin or etc.? So just to say that the thing I've been thinking about in this talk, I think is not, just specific to Christianity. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm really curious what questions people might have.
Thank you, Michael. That was really insightful, interesting, and a lot of questions you raised and interesting scenarios. Looks like we already have a question from Pranav. So Pranav, you can switch on your video, unmute yourself, and you can talk to Michael directly. Let me see how I can. Yes. Yeah, now you can go ahead and talk to Michael directly.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
I got you.
Hey, Michael, thanks for the talk.
Hey, thank you.
All right. Can you see me as well, or are you just hearing me?
I just hear you at the moment.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah.
I just typed out my questions, so I'm just going to read them out.
Oh, should I look at the chat here maybe? But yeah, go.
Yeah, I'm just going to read it out.
Okay, go for it.
You can
Yeah.
look at it as you're
Yeah.
listening to me. So I'm mostly sympathetic with your argument, so my questions aren't addressed to the argument specifically. I have two sorts of questions that go beyond your argument. So the first one is, what's the soteriological role of praying without ceasing in Christianity? So in other words, what happens if we fail to pray without ceasing? And secondly, is there room to interpret the injunction to pray without ceasing non-literally? So that what's being asked is not necessarily prayer, but something like an increasing divinization of life. So this is what the Bhagavad Gita tells spiritual aspirants to do. I think what you mentioned towards the end is also keeping in spirit with what I'm saying here. So the idea is to dedicate as much of our life as possible, including everyday actions as well as grand projects. So suppose, yeah, for academics, maybe books or something like that, to God. So it goes beyond, attention, phenomenology, consciousness, things like that, to more concrete things, as it were, like our actions and so on. All right. So
Awesome.
those are my two questions.
Awesome. Yeah. So like soteriological. So that has to do with salvation. That's this long word for being saved, like in the Christian way of thinking about things. So the question, if I fail to pray for a period of time, does that mean I've lost my salvation? I'd say no. That's really a very stringent, sort of strict way of thinking about God's expectations of us. I think of it more as it might be true that we ought to do it. Maybe it's a certain ideal. And I think it's often good to be aware of those ideals, but I don't think each failure to meet the ideal is met with like judgment or something. Rather, it's something that God is walking alongside of us and helping us to increasingly come closer and closer to. That's the way I think of it. So the people who are walking with God and coming closer and closer to where He's taking them, those people are safe. They're safe. They're okay. They're saved. Those people may not be perfect. I'm not. None of us would be perfect, but those people are definitely saved. So I hope that kind of gets the at the soteriological part of your question.
Yes.
The second part, non-literally. Yeah. So actually, 1 Thessalonians 5:17. About half of the commentaries I was able to find on that verse interpreted it as a kind of hyperbole, right? So when we read it, we shouldn't read without ceasing or adialepos, the Greek, as a sort of not a literal, like constant through time sort of notion. Instead, according to these commentaries, it should be interpreted as a hyperbole or an exaggeration for something like pray as much as you can, or pray a lot, or pray frequently, or pray persistently, something like that. Something you can do, but still is not necessarily easy to do. I think that that reading is possibly plausible, but it's only plausible if it's not, in fact, possible to pray without ceasing. So the reason something would be hyperbolic is it's so exaggerated, it's impossible. And then you immediately understand, oh, okay, it must be some other thing. But if you can actually understand how it is possible, then we don't have reason to think that it's so exaggerated that it's impossible, right? So the thought is it's at least worth exploring its possibility. And if it turns out that without doing any damage to what prayer actually is, it really is possible, then I have less reason to think that it's hyperbole. So that's sort of where I'm at in the project. Like it seems like, okay, oh, I don't have to think it's hyperbole because it actually does seem to be possible. And I'm not really mangling the meaning of the word prayer. I'm not sure exactly that's what you meant with non-literal, but that's what it made me think of with the question. You can have other notions of maybe like, though it's the word is prayer, or the word is think of me, in the Bhagavad Gita or whatever. Really, it's some other things that we're supposed to be doing, like, being righteous or doing what we're supposed to do or being devout or a litany of other possible things that where we're interpreting the language a little bit more figuratively. But in any case, when we're thinking about First Thessalonians, that's sort of my thought process with that. Does that help, or you want to have follow-ups on that?
Yeah, that's helpful. No, I mean, so I was thinking of non-literal interpretations for the word prayer. So you keep unceasing and all of that in place. So the idea is that
Yeah.
your mode of engagement, whatever that is, that must be unceasing. It's just that it's not prayer, it could be something else. So are there any commentators
Yeah.
in the New Testament who think of that, or they're like, oh, there's a reason the word prayer is used and we need to grapple with that?
Yeah. Awesome. So actually the worry about First Thessalonians 5:17 goes back to a second century philosopher theologian named Origen. And so he was like, well, we can't do this for, constantly. So what do we make of this? And he gave a different meaning for prayer. He said we can think of prayer as just the entire life of a saint. So the entire life of a saint, the holy thing, whatever they're doing through their life, that is a sort of itself a prayer to God. which I think is just a really different way of thinking about prayer than the Lord sort of literal meaning of prosukomai, the word prayer.
Yeah.
And then Augustine, I think he has a commentary where he says, your desire that you have in your heart, that's your prayer, whether unstated or not. Like, so because God is aware of your desires. So your desire is your prayer, which is really weird because you might think, all of us desire all the time, but it doesn't seem like we're all praying at all times. So yes, there's definitely been this sort of discussion of other ways of thinking about prayer. Some people will immediately say, okay, this means that there's another sense of prayer, the sense of prayer that's at issue in 1 Thessalonians 5:17. There's a lot to say here. Actually, the paper that I recently got accepted sort of gives some arguments that are relevant to this. So that paper is Prayer and Communion, where I'm sort of suggesting that we don't need to assume that there's any sort of different use of the word prayer here, unless we're really forced into that position. And it doesn't seem like we're forced into that position. It would be kind of an ad hoc meaning. And I think it's actually more plausible to take the without ceasing as hyperbolic than to take prayer as sort of just meaning anything whatsoever. I think I'd rather do that. And then also, before we even take without ceasing as hyperbole, we can explore that, okay, maybe it is possible. And to the degree that that is plausible, we don't have to take either without ceasing as hyperbole, and we don't have to say there's this special meaning for prayer in just this one verse, whereas it means, has a very clear meaning in all these other verses. That's sort of how I think about it. But there's a lot of,
Thanks. That was very helpful.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. I'll say something that came to my mind as listening to you. The two verses you quoted from the Bhagavad Gita and, of course, the New Testament lines and explanations that you gave, interpretations, seem to be all in what Indian philosophy or Hindu philosophy might call as dualistic mode of thinking or connecting with God. But then there is non-dualistic mode also in Hinduism, which is missing in Christianity or Islam. So for the most part, so the Sanskrit word is Advait. What you referred in your talk is all Dvait, that is dualistic, which means God is separate and devotee is separate. A practitioner or devotee or human being is separate from God. Christianity, Islam, and dualistic mode in Hinduism. But then there is non-dualistic way. Now, connecting to God or praying to God in your words, prayer is extremely important in Christianity, obviously. So prayer, quote unquote, if I say, sorry, all right. So connecting to God, incorporating the non-dualistic modes in Hinduism, if we combine them both, there are 4 ways a Hindu can connect with God. And here are those, all 4. I'm giving in the chat window. So there is what is called as Raja Yoga. Raja Yoga means meditating, which could be non-dualistic, realizing that divinity is in me and divinity is universal. So I'm not separate from God. In a way, I realize my universal divine identity by my own meditation. I am God, in short, which is radically different from Christianity. Only in Hinduism that is, but also in Buddhism. When somebody can say, I am the Buddha by my nature, I just have to realize my true potential. Yeah. So that's non-dualistic, all right? Yeah. Number 1. Number 2, right? That's Raj Yoga. Second is Bhakti Yoga. Bhakti Yoga is very similar to what you described. Devotion to God, chanting for God, singing hymns for God, which is highly dualistic. Right? Third is Jnana Yoga or Jnana Yoga, which is intellectual understanding of the divinity, which could be both non-dualistic and dualistic also, depending on one's choice or one's state of mind. And finally, there is Karma Yoga, which could be dualistic for the most part, in which you act all your actions, like you were saying, saint, entire life is a manifestation or demonstration of a prayer. So in Hindu terms, doing all service, everything whatever you do your entire life, any service, charity, philanthropy, or any work you do is all devoted to God. That's karma. Karma is action. So yoga of action, divine action, devoted or devotional action. That could be also dualistic or non-dualistic, right? In which I say that I'm trying to manifest my divinity through my actions. So how I connect with what you presented, that excellent example that you gave, charity and the green background. What if everything is divine? Charity is also divine. The background is divine from Hindu perspective, non-dualistic perspective. Everything is divine. So the trees are divine, reptiles are divine, animals are divine, entire cosmos is divine. So there is no question of periphery or center. This whole thing can be really challenged by if we bring in non-dualistic perspective. But of course, in dualistic perspective, it comes very close to Christianity that when do I think of God? But if everything is God, everything is divine in non-dualistic perspective, it doesn't matter. Right?
I love it. So, well, yeah.
Yes.
I think that this idea that based on the way we're conceiving of things, that even ordinary stuff could have this reference to God or the divine, or as you put it, well, in non-dualism it would be God, but even in dualism, if it could have a reference to God based on how you sort of understand it, right?
Yes.
So in the example I gave of the wooden cross, like because of the symbolism and the tradition there, okay, that refers to God, right? And so being aware of the cross allows you to be aware of God. I think a person could come to a point of their spiritual journey where they really conceive of everything in a certain way. And so this will change in different traditions, but say in the Christian one, you conceive of everything you are in contact with as something created by God, something maybe sustained by God and God's grace, something that, that God is like co-present with, like God is omnipresent. So wherever, this pen is also there, right? And God created the pen or whatever. So you could, I think, come to a point where you sort of see things in that way all the time. And I think an analogy here would be, imagine a physicist who's just like obsessed with physics, and he's just always thinking about physics. And so whenever he sees anything, any object, he like sees it in those physics terms, like, oh, those are the electrons. He knows that there's like these vector fields that are upholding the pen or whatever, right? And he just automatically experiences it in that sort of really detailed physicsy sort of way. And that's just built into his experience. Well, I think possibly a person could come to the point where they experience the world like that, but it's not the physicsy sort of aspect, it's the divine or the God aspect. And this is something that God has created and God is sustaining, or whatever it is. Or if you're a non-dualist, this is God in some sense, right? So I think our experience, I don't think it requires non-dualism. I think it could also hold in a dualist way of thinking, that even that those trees themselves have that reference to God.
Right.
But the thing is, it requires this reorientation of how we're conceiving of what we're experiencing, which is very possible. So just in general, a physicist will experience the world differently than a non-physicist. And so we can change the way we experience and conceive of the things that we interact with. That's sort of what I would, there's a lot more you said there that I think is worth, asking about, but that's the first thought I have as a sort of response.
Good, thank you.
Yeah.
Very thought-provoking, yes, nice. And so, anything else, Pranav or Miss Hatcher is also online if she has any questions for you. Yeah, they can unmute themselves and ask you. Rahul Batra has joined. If there are no more questions, then I guess we can end here. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry I joined, and I'm quite upset at that because I really wanted to join this session. Was the objective of the session to understand how prayer plays a central role in our culture, Indian knowledge system, or was it about the right ways, or what was the objective? Could you just tell me in a line or two?
Well, so the objective for my talk was I'm trying to understand how it might be possible to pray without ceasing. And the way that I got interested in that in my tradition was there's this verse in First Thessalonians that says to pray without ceasing. And then throughout church history, different people have worried about how is this possible? How could we possibly do this? And then I was exploring a suggestion that is traced to The Way of a Pilgrim. It's this book that explores if we can pray without ceasing. And the suggestion is that maybe we can pray without stopping throughout our day, but in the periphery or background of our experience. And then I was using some tools to say, well, there's different parts of the periphery of our experience. There's something called the context, there's something called the margin, and which of those is at issue, and something like that. So the thought was to explore our experience and what are the structure of our consciousness, so that maybe that exploration could inform our spiritual practices. Because there's actually parallels with this issue in Hinduism, although I have so much to learn about what that looks like in detail, but I don't think it's just an issue that applies to First Thessalonians. And in Christianity, I think it's a more general issue as well. But anyways, that was sort of how I was conceiving of the purpose of the talk. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe I can add a line or two on that. Christianity, of course, does not have an origin in India, but many Indians are coming to terms to understand and to learn that Christianity has a presence, at least legendary or mythical presence in India for almost 2 millennia. Christianity in India is older than Christianity in Europe from those legendary sources. So one of the earliest apostles of Jesus Christ, Saint Thomas, is said to have reached India within a century of crucifixion of Jesus. So that makes Christianity almost 2 millennia old in Kerala. Kerala is where Saint Thomas Christians are still called. They take pride that there are PBS reports available on YouTube from American reporters that they proudly say that we are Christians by religion, Hindu by culture, and Indian by citizenship. So Christianity is very much part of Indian culture, Indian system for almost 2 millennia. But how much do we really understand about Christian theology and role of prayer, which Professor Hatchet went so much in detail, and especially, and it can be like he said, very easily can be compared with dualistic mode of Hinduism, certainly. And of course, in Buddhism and Jainism also has similar ideas, but then there are also non-dual mode very strong in both Buddhism and Hinduism, especially. So I guess that makes it at least some overlaps with what we normally term as Indian knowledge systems, which are rooted in dharmic systems, but Christianity is also very, very ancient for Indian knowledge system. Is my little humble take on the question by Mr. Batra. Anything else? Anyone else? All right. Thank you so much, Professor Hatchet. It was fun listening to you in detail what you have been working on for years now. And we look forward. Thank you. Thank you for showing your full face again. And we look forward to your more publications and more comparative work on especially compared with dualistic mode of Hinduism. It would be really interesting. I think there's much scope to do comparative theology, as many are doing. There is a lot of scope, and there are journals devoted to this idea of what you have just presented, Philosophy East and West, published by University of Hawaii. You may be already aware of that, but there are many more such avenues I think that we can explore. And so thank you again for keeping us in communication, Christianity and Hinduism, and we look forward to your more talks. Thank you so much. We'll record it, and we have already recorded. We will upload it on YouTube, and we'll share the links with all the.
Jain,
Thank you so much.
Professor Jain, if I can ask one question.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
At Flame University, how are you blending IKS or knowledge of religion, in your courses? Are you blending it?
I invite you to take a look at our website, indiacenter.flame.edu.in.
Okay.
We have been running this center for the last 4 years, and we have done a lot of webinars and publications op-eds in media outlets everywhere. So we can talk one-on-one also after the webinar.
Okay,
All right.
sure. Great.
Thank you, Mr. Batra. All right. Thank you, Professor Hatchet.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Pranav Ambadekar for joining us, Ms. Hatchet for joining us, and Mr. Batra for joining us. So thank you all the attendees, and thank you, Professor Hatchet. With that,
All right, thank you.